Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Wednesday, the 13th of July. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. This evening, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 140 of the illegal Russian war of aggression. Then I will introduce our guest for this evening, and then we will look together at today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. Ukraine's Foreign Minister, Dmytro Kuleba, has ruled out ceding territory to Russia as part of any ceasefire deal. In a briefing, he said no peace talks were underway between Moscow and Kyiv because of Russia's position and its continued aggression against our country. Russian artillery and rockets pounded the Ukrainian town of Bakhmut overnight and into Wednesday morning. The Donetsk governor, Pavlo Kyrylenko, said Russian forces were constantly shelling the entire Free Territory of Donetsk region, with Bakhmut district suffering the most. The Russian Ministry of Defense has said it caused large losses to Ukrainian forces in the last 24 hours, claiming to have killed at least 425 service personnel, shot down 4 planes and 9 unmanned drones. Yuri Ichnat, a spokesperson for the Ukrainian Air Force, dismissed Russia's assertions as propaganda. At least 5 people have been injured and 1 killed by Russian shelling in the region of Kharkiv, according to the daily update from the regional governor, Ole Sinihubov. He posted to Telegram this morning to say the terror of the civilian population of Kharkiv region by the Russian occupiers continues. At least 7 people were reportedly killed by a Ukrainian missile strike on a large ammunition store in the town of Nova Kakhovka in Russian-occupied Kherson. The claims of fatalities attributed to recently acquired US weapons were made by the Russian-installed administration in the town and could not be immediately verified. The death toll from a weekend Russian missile attack on a residential apartment block in Chasiv Yar in eastern Ukraine has risen to at least 47. According to Kyiv, the residential building was hit by Russian rockets fired from truck-borne systems late on Saturday evening. The Ukrainian emergency services initially gave a death toll of 10, but as rescue teams continue to comb through the debris, that number has risen. Military delegations from Ukraine, Russia, and Turkey are meeting UN officials in Istanbul to discuss a possible deal to resume safe exports of Ukrainian grain. The 4-way meeting comes as exports across the Black Sea continue to be blocked by Russian warships and by mines that Kiev has laid to avert a feared amphibious assault. North Korea has officially recognized the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic and the self-proclaimed Luhansk People's Republic, the pro-Russian occupied territories in the east of Ukraine. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea becomes only the 3rd UN member state to recognize them as legitimate authorities, following Russia and Syria. And the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has called for an immediate halt to Russian deportations of Ukrainian citizens. Blinken accused Russia of deliberately separating Ukrainian children from their parents and abducting others from orphanages before putting them up for adoption inside Russia. Now, I'm delighted that we are joined this evening by Paul McLennan MSP. Paul has been the MSP for East Lothian since 2021. He served as a local councillor for the Dunbar and East Linton member ward of East Lothian Council since 2007 and was both the SNP group leader and the council leader from 2007 to 2012. He has also been a board member of the NHS Lothian, the regional offices of Scottish Enterprise and the Commission on School Reform. Paul, good evening. How are you keeping?
Not bad. I'm doing 2 weeks into the summer recess and as busy as ever. Slightly different focus and getting out and speaking to the community. I didn't have that chance last year, so really enjoying it the first 2 weeks of recess so far. So
Oh, that's excellent. I hope the weather stays warm and dry for you if you're on the doorsteps this summer. That'll be grand.
it's been good.
We'll go to our first story now, because the Chancellor, Nadim Zahawi, and Jeremy Hunt have both been knocked out of the Tory leadership race to replace Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. The chair of the Backbench 1922 committee, Sir Graham Brady, revealed that 6 candidates had made it through the first round after receiving more than 30 votes. Both Jeremy Hunt, who received 18 votes, and Nadim Zahawi, who received 25 votes, were knocked out. Rishi Sunak stormed through Wednesday's vote, receiving 88 nominations in favour of him becoming Prime Minister. Penny Mordaunt came a close second, receiving 67 votes, and Liz Truss was at her heels with 50 votes. The other results were Tom Tugendhat, 37, Kemi Badenoch, 40, and Suella Braverman, 32. A second round of voting is set to take place tomorrow until only two candidates remain in the leadership contest. The voting process is set to be completed by the Westminster Parliament summer recess on the 21st of July, and the final two will then face Conservative Party members at a series of hustings over the summer. In a statement on Twitter after the results were announced, Jeremy Hunt said, "I want to thank my incredible team of loyal and talented supporters who put their faith in me. It's become obvious to me you only get one big shot at this, and I had mine in 2019. Nevertheless, it is clear that our party has an exciting future with the amazing array of talent on offer in this contest, and I feel confident that we are on track to win back trust." A gentle word of advice, he continued, to the remaining candidates: smears and attacks may bring short-term tactical gain, but always backfire in the long term. The nation is watching, and they've had enough of our drama. Be the Broadchurch and the unbeatable election-winning machine that our country deserves. A spokeswoman for Liz Truss, who hasn't even launched her campaign yet, said, "Now is the time for colleagues to unite behind the candidate who will cut taxes, deliver the real economic change we need from day one, and ensure Putin loses in Ukraine. Liz has the experience to deliver the benefits of Brexit from day one, grow our economy, and support working families." So, Paul, what's your first take, or what's the main thing that you're feeling with regard to the latest Tory psychodrama that's playing out on our screens?
I think the first comment for me would be it's almost this is taking part in a parallel universe. And in terms of the voting, I'm not surprised, that Rishi Sunak came through as top. I think the second spot, if you like, I think will be between Penny Mordaunt and Liz Truss. But I think when you've seen all the candidates speak over the last number of days and couple of weeks and so on, they're all talking about having to rebuild the economy. They're talking about tax cuts with no details on the tax cuts. They're talking about rebuilding the economy, which they've presided over, including Rishi Sunak, who's talking about rebuilding the economy when he's been the Chancellor for a number of months and years. They're obviously just trying to appeal to the Tory faithful, if you like. First of all, their MPs, and then obviously their membership. So it's taken part almost in a vacuum, I think, of what's actually going on in the real world. And we've heard nothing, or virtually nothing, around about the cost of living crisis, which is the biggest issue facing us all just now. And all they're trying to talk about is tax cuts. So, it highlights, regardless of who the leader is of the Tory party, it won't change their policies, their philosophy. And again, that's towards tax cuts. Again, that's towards how they target the most vulnerable in society with their policies. And certainly it doesn't help Scotland in any way, one way or another. Whether it's Boris Johnson, Penny Mordaunt, Rishi Sunak, or Liz Truss, they will all disregard Scotland the same way as they have now.
That's a very good point, Paul. You were saying that you've been able to be out on the streets and the doorsteps a little bit. What have you been seeing or hearing from either from your colleagues who are Tory MSPs or alternatively from voters in East Lothian?
I think from the MSP point of view, and speaking to Tory colleagues, I suppose before they were all desperate to get rid of Boris Johnson. I think that's more because of the detrimental impact that's had on seen that in the council elections. On that, I don't think it's because of his policies. I think it's in terms of how he was impacting on the Tory fortunes on the council elections and in Scotland. Not once did you hear criticism of his policies. Not once did you see the Tories jump up and talking about when they cut the universal credit by £20. So there's that. It's very, very focused on preserving their own seats, preserving their own electoral fortunes. In terms of voters, I think it's very clear that it has damaged the Tories. There is no doubt about that. In terms of how people see them, in terms of Boris Johnson, and again, Boris Johnson was a leader, but the other people in his cabinet and supporters, again, didn't come out and talk around about the policies that he had. They agreed with them. It was around about the electoral damage he was doing to them, and of course his own personal discipline, if you like, and being prime minister. So It won't change the policy outlook, and I think people see through that. To be honest with, in terms of the voters.
That's a good point. I was listening to some Tory MPs speaking from the House of Commons today, and it was apparent that they are already beginning to rip up Johnson's record, whatever record he has, for example, with on the economy. This was from people who were Treasury ministers last week, and who've been closely involved in Johnsonian economic policy, and they're starting to rip it up already. Do you think will the wider electorate accept Tories who now, they made policy last week and are now trashing it and tearing it up this week?
I think people will see that. I think we've seen, especially with Sajid Javid, he talked around about when he gave his resignation speech that he felt uneasy about some of the policies that were coming forward, and didn't say a thing and said he should have come forward earlier on. And it's fine looking back in hindsight and saying they should have said these things. It's collective responsibility. They've all agreed to the policies that's been brought forward by Johnson. I think both behind closed doors and also in front of the camera, they've been very clear about supporting that. And as I said, I don't think that they'll distance themselves from Boris Johnson as a person. Whether they distance themselves in terms of policy, I very much doubt it in terms of that. And when they're trying to almost out Tory themselves, in terms of that, I'm going to give you more tax cuts and so on. They have no, they're not highlighting where it's coming from. And there's no detail behind it, and people see through that. They're trying to appeal to a very, very narrow part of the UK constituency, if you like, about their own membership, and that's who they're targeting it just now. There's certainly no discussion and relevance to voters in the rest of the UK, and certainly not in Scotland, around about what policy differences or what they would bring to a premiership. It's all around about trying to secure the Tory, first of all, the Tory support for Tory MPs, and then their own membership, which is a tiny, tiny part of the electorate in the UK.
And that's an interesting point you make, Paul, as well. In his tweet admitting that he had lost, Jeremy Hunt admitted that to being yesterday's man, and that yesterday for him was 2019. But then he went on to ask for the smears and attacks to end because the country is tired of them. Now, we know that the Labour Party had been provided with at least two dossiers by competing candidates smearing each other. And I'm sure there's more of that. So do you think you mentioned Tory membership? Do you think the Tory membership are tired of that approach, that cutthroat approach? And do you think the country is tired of it too?
I certainly think so. I think one of the key things I think for me, one is obviously there's the first part of the competition at the moment around about who's going to be Prime Minister. Well, is obviously securing the MP support. What you'll tend to see in the membership, I think the membership tends to be more to the right of the parliamentary party. So again, I think you may see once you get down to the next two, the last two, I think there's going to be discussions again about how far to the right will the Tory party go. And I certainly think if you're looking at either Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss or Perdy Mordaunt, they tend to be on the right of the party. And I think once we get down to the last two, it will be, who can give more tax cuts. And I think we've seen Suella Braverman come out, was it yesterday, the day before, talking around about people who are on benefits, is almost to say, that they're not doing enough to go and find work. It was incredible. It was incredibly naive or incredibly cruel interpretation and so far removed from reality. I think that they are. So again, I think within the broader country, no. I think at the moment they're very, very insular and about trying to secure the MP support and then go and support the membership. But it's not touching on the debates that the people in the UK and Scotland are talking about, and that is primarily the cost of living crisis.
Thanks, Paul. Cruel certainly sounds like an appropriate word, and dislocated from reality as well. We'll look at this story, the wider ramifications of what's going on with our next item, however, because the government is to table a confidence motion in itself after rejecting a version by Labour that directly criticised Boris Johnson. The unexpected move will force Conservative MPs to back the government, but will make the vote more straightforward, as it will not constitute an endorsement of the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister's press secretary said that Johnson had planned to open the debate ahead of the vote on Monday. She insisted Labour's own motion, including the Commons not having confidence in the Prime Minister, was not good use of parliamentary time. A Labour source said that the decision was madness and one that they expected would backfire. Not sure Tory leadership candidates or marginal MPs will welcome this, they said. Labour had reacted with fury on Tuesday night when Downing Street refused to allow parliamentary time for the motion it had tabled. Long-standing convention is that if the leader of the official opposition tables a motion of no confidence, the government must make time for it to be debated and voted on. Tory Whip said that Labour's motion fell outside the scope of the convention by identifying Johnson. However, Labour said that the motion had been ruled in order by the House of Commons clerks, and it also pointed to a 1965 confidence motion which mentioned the Prime Minister. So, Paul, firstly, another long-standing convention abandoned. Does that indicate to you that there's a conspiracy going on, or it's another cock-up?
I think this is a very deliberate choice by Boris Johnson and the UK government. I know Boris Johnson now obviously lost power, but in terms of the decision that they've made, I mean, it's breaking protocols. This has been the norm for Boris Johnson's premiership. I think the decision they've made on this one isn't just highlighting the norm for Boris Johnson's premiership, but also where the Tory party stand in terms of, I suppose, parliamentary democracy in terms of that. So I think it's very worrying in that regard, because I think that if they're showing, I suppose, disregard for almost that parliamentary, I suppose, the way that it's been run in the past, I think it highlights issues that we're going to see this. This will continue beyond Boris Johnson. It will continue beyond Boris Johnson, and I think it almost it becomes part of the comedy farce we've seen in the last couple of weeks. With Boris Johnson hanging on, having 60 resignations, actually now proposing a vote of no confidence in his own government. You couldn't make this up. You literally couldn't make this up.
Absolutely. And there were a couple of points you made there I was going to ask you about, Paul. Does this latest event reinforce the idea that under the uncodified constitution in the UK, the Prime Minister operates very much as some kind of elected king with very few checks and balances?
Yeah, very much, because I think when you go back, one of the key issues, I think one of the defining issues in Boris Johnson's premiership was obviously the prorogue in Parliament. When we talked about that and the legal disputes and discussions about that in itself, I think, shocked people. In terms of where we are now and what they're trying to do, I mean, obviously the whole Partygate affairs and the way that was looked upon. I know we're touching on other issues later on around about, I suppose, ministers and inquiries and so on. I think it kind of highlights a complete disregard for parliamentary democracy, and it's almost policy made in the hoof. And you're right, and it comes back to the point there is no constitution in the UK, and they literally get away with anything that they want to do. And precedent sometimes is the only thing that you've got there to almost hold to stand back on and hold back on and compare things. But with having no constitution, they literally get away with whatever they want to get away with, and I think that they are very clear on that, and I think they know that they can push the boundaries as far as they want to. It's a problem. It's a real problem in terms of that. I don't think a change of premiership will change that at all. I think it's just where the modern day Tory party are just now in terms of how they respect democracy.
Well, that's a good point, Paul. In terms of disregard for democracy, we know both the government and the official opposition in Westminster are determined, apparently, to disregard democracy for Scottish voters. So, do you think this is a part of a wider issue with Westminster politics? It doesn't. It finds itself, or it wills itself, or it puts itself in the position of disregarding democracy over and over again.
Yeah. I mean, I think Boris Johnson looked at the situation, and he quoted this in his resignation speech, saying he had an 80-seat majority, and I think because they think they had an 80-seat majority, they've got they've got the right to do whatever they want. That's not the case, and I think they've kind of and said Boris Johnson touched on that they can literally do what they want because they've got such a large majority, and it's not going to help them electorally. Now they've still got up to possibility to another 2 years before they go to the country again in terms of UK Parliament elections. So I think they don't think that this will do them any damage in the long term, and they're trying to get away with what we can get away with at the moment. I think now it's at a tipping point that people are just seeing time after time, occasion after occasion, there's a complete disregard for democracy in terms of that. I think with an 80-seat majority, they can do whatever they want, and we need to hold them to account. And both, as I said, what the Scottish Government can do, and also in terms of the SNP group down at Westminster. I know that they're doing their best they can in that regard.
Thanks, Paul. We'll touch on that holding the government to account point in a moment. But first, I was going to talk about a phrase that you've used already this evening, because the SNP has said that independence is the only way for Scotland to rid itself of more toxic Tory austerity as the Tory leadership race to the right rumbles on. It follows alarming comments made by the current front-runner and former Chancellor Rishi Sunak, who claimed that he will govern the country like Margaret Thatcher, while Nadhim Zahawi had threatened to cut NHS and education budgets by 20%. Kirsten Oswald MP has warned that candidates are trying to out-Thatcher Thatcher with their damaging policies, warning that no matter who wins, Scotland will find itself under the control of a Tory Prime Minister it did not vote for. Commenting, Kirsten Oswald MP said, "Be in no doubt, the only way for Scotland to rid itself of more toxic Tory austerity is by becoming an independent country. So far, we've seen candidates competing on who can out-Thatcher Thatcher, with Rishi Sunak going as far as to say that he will govern just like her." Meanwhile, candidates like Nadhim Zahawi are prepared to slash NHS and educate budgets if elected. It's clear that this Tory race to the right will be devastating for Scotland. Whoever replaces Boris Johnson, Scotland will find itself yet again under the control of a Westminster Tory government it did not vote for, imposing cruel and callous policies we do not support. Scotland wants a different future to the one being imposed under Westminster control. Brexit has cost our economy billions, and Tory cuts are pushing people into poverty. Therefore, the only way to keep Scotland safe and deliver meaningful change is to become an independent country. So, Paul, the reference to Mrs. Thatcher there took me somewhat by surprise. At least, again, as you were saying, from a Scottish perspective, I don't think anyone would regard Mrs. Thatcher as having a positive, being viewed in a positive light in Scotland. So, to what extent does this psychodrama, I've called it this evening, that's playing out, reinforce the message that the Westminster government and Tory politics and the Tory policies simply do not resonate with Scots who largely don't vote Tory at all?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it comes back, it's almost a single transferable policy between all the Tory candidates in terms of, one, there's a complete disregard for Scotland. And I think when you see that, when you've seen all their shiny videos, there's no mention of Scotland whatsoever in any of their presentations, in any of their discussions. Scotland's an afterthought. They get asked around about it. And you've seen in terms of, should Scotland have another independence referendum? 10 years. Now's not the time, 10 years. So you've had Alistair Jack in the past talk about 25 years, 40 years. You've had other Tory candidates come out and say at least 10 years. It's literally policy making on the hoof. But the one key thing that's riding through that is that there's a complete disregard for democracy. There's a complete disregard for democracy. There's a pro-independence majority. This is supposedly a voluntary union. And any time you ask any unionist politician, particularly Tories, is this a voluntary union? They can't answer that. If there's not an independence majority, then how is an independence referendum? Then how are the will of the Scottish people who voted a pro-independence majority of Parliament? How is that going to be recognised and acknowledged? And they can't answer that question because they know they have no leg to stand on in terms of the democratic right for the people of Scotland. And this isn't for the democratic right for the SNP to hold a referendum or the Green Party to hold a referendum. It's a democratic right of the people who voted the pro-independence majority to have that referendum. That's what they voted for. That's what the people of Scotland should be having the right to do and make their own choice. Of course, you completely, if the Tories want to oppose independence, of course they can. If Labour want to do it, why they do it, and I still don't understand that, then it's up to them. But you can't deny the democratic right of the people of Scotland to choose their own future. The more they do that, the more it's going to shore up support for independence.
Thanks, Paul. And for anyone listening or watching who's triggered by the mention of Mrs. Thatcher's name, I'm reminded of Frankie Boyle's comment that rather than spend money on her state funeral, we should have bought everyone in Scotland a shovel and we would have handed her back to the devil ourselves. But we'll move on and look at this point that you were making earlier with regard to holding politicians to account, because Priti Patel has refused to attend a planned session giving evidence to Parliament's Home Affairs Committee, and will not answer questions until after the Conservative leadership election if she is still in the job. The Home Secretary was due to be questioned on issues including the Rwanda migrant deal, violence against women and girls, policing, and passport delays on Wednesday morning. Minutes before the session was due to start, the Home Affairs Committee tweeted, "This morning at 10 a.m., we were due to be questioning the Home Secretary, Priti Patel. She has declined to attend our session." The SNP MP Stuart MacDonald, who sits on the committee, said the Home Secretary emailed the committee shortly before 5 p.m. yesterday to cancel her appearance. The reason given was recent changes in government, including to her ministerial team, following the wave of resignations that ousted Boris Johnson. In her email to the committee, Ms Patel said its scrutiny was always a priority for the department and me. The committee will be aware of the recent changes in government, and in particular the ministerial team in my department, she wrote. Regrettably, as a result of this and the wider unprecedented changes since I agreed to give evidence, I will no longer be able to meet with the committee tomorrow. I would, however, like to ensure that the session goes ahead at the next appropriate point and suggest that we postpone until a mutually agreed date in September. The chair of the Home Affairs Committee, Diana Johnson, called the refusal to attend Wednesday's evidence session wholly unacceptable. This date was agreed months in advance, and the reason given for why the Home Secretary cannot attend this morning, due to changes in the Home Office ministerial team, does not make sense, as it was the Home Secretary giving evidence and not one of the ministerial team. As such, it is essential that our committee is able to scrutinise the policy and actions of this government, and, in these uncertain times, even more so. Ms Johnson reminded Ms Patel that she was still the Home Secretary and pointed to a previous statement suggesting that she did not resign alongside Cabinet colleagues because she wanted to focus on the business of government and national security. The committee chair added, "We would therefore ask why, a week on, you now feel it is acceptable to avoid a key element of the role, facing up to the much needed scrutiny of that essential work." Commenting on Priti Patel refusing to give evidence today, Stuart MacDonald MP said, "We have people across the UK waiting too long for passports, for Windrush compensation, and for asylum claims, as well as people still in detention pending removal to Rwanda, all of which Priti Patel is responsible for, and all of which she was due to be questioned on. Now those awaiting answers will have to wait even longer." Just last week, the Home Secretary said she had to be entirely focused on the business of government and national security. It seems that she has now changed her mind. The Ministerial Code makes clear ministers have a duty to Parliament to be held to account for the policies and actions of the departments. Yet in the space of 2 weeks, we have had two Cabinet Secretaries pull out of giving evidence to committees, just hours before they were due to attend. So, Paul, firstly, an astonishing story this afternoon. So, the Home Secretary said that she had declined to meet. Is she hiding something, for example, to do with Rwanda?
First of all, Andrew, I think it's incredible arrogance in terms of that. You know, she's known the date. Preparations by ministers or cabinet secretaries in Scotland, in fact, go ahead weeks in advance of this. It's not something that's put together in a day or so. So she would have had the evidence and talked through, I have no doubt, with her civil servants in that regard. So there's no reason that she wasn't prepared in terms of that. In terms of the constitution, as you said, you know, I suppose the precedent said before, you know, if if democracy fails at committee level, it's really, and that's incredibly worrying in terms of that, because if Parliament, whether it's in Scotland or in the UK, loses its ability to scrutinise ministers, that's incredibly worrying. These are issues that I see in certainly my casework. That, you know, the passport issue is one that we are seeing almost on a daily basis about people having issues with passports. Asylum issues also are more related, obviously, to the UK Parliament and and MPs. But it's extremely worrying when you see that, and you know, and I think one, she's trying to buy herself time. There's no coincidence that we've got the UK parliamentary recess coming up, which is going to give her at least a couple of months process. And I think the key thing, and all the issues that you mentioned, whether it's passports, asylum, Rwanda, the policy implications of the mess that they're making is really damaging, the people who are impacted at the front of this. So yeah, I think she's literally just trying to avoid the scrutiny because she knows she would be in for a hard time. There's no excuse that it was cancelled at all, and I think they've used the recess this as an excuse. She's actually mentioning about coming back in September. So,
Yep.
and she may not be in that position come September, and I think she's hedging her bets on that. I think so. It's a terrible decision. It's incredibly arrogant in terms of that, and it can't be allowed. The parliamentary authorities should be insisting that she gives evidence, and it can never be allowed again. We can't have that. People fall ill, and these issues sometimes happen. In terms of just declining to go, that's not acceptable. It can't be in a parliamentary democracy. It's not acceptable.
Yeah, it's an interesting
And Andrew,
theme there.
another key thing, sorry,
Yes, go on.
just to make a point on that
Yeah.
as well, it's not just, I mean, in certain occasions, the Scottish Parliament have asked for UK ministers to come and give evidence in terms of their policy implications in Scotland. On many, many, many occasions, they have declined to come up to Scotland and give evidence to our own committees about government decisions by the UK government and implying on ourselves. There's a precedent set up here as well. They very rarely come up and speak to the Scottish Parliament committees.
No, it's a good point. And what I was going to say that it resonates with me that I think it was Dominic Cummings, when he was an advisor, refused repeatedly to attend House of Commons committees. So it strikes me it's maybe a bit of a theme here amongst some people who have been advising and helping in Johnson's cabinet. But to tie back to a point you were making earlier, and speaking about is this inability to hold cabinet ministers to account, is this an indication? Firstly, that the uncodified constitution that Westminster operates under is simply not fit for purpose.
It highlights that, and I think we've seen that over that period of time. From proroguing the Parliament into the way that Boris Johnson disregards Parliament, talking about the vote of no confidence, we were talking about before. This issue not appearing that there's an emerging theme, and this isn't about Boris Johnson as a personality and Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. This is about his government and his party and the way that they try and disregard parliamentary democracy in terms of that. It's not just Boris Johnson. This won't change when Boris Johnson moves on. And we've seen that. I think that the government, whoever the Prime Minister will be, will continue in the exact same manner as Boris Johnson had. So they may change a leader. They're certainly not going to change their attitude to parliamentary democracy in any way, shape, or form.
Well, that's an interesting point that you make, Paul. Stuart MacDonald MP mentioned the ministerial code. Now, after Johnson's behaviour and his rewriting of the code, and now Cabinet Secretaries point blank refusing to attend House of Commons committees, is the ministerial code even worth the paper it's written on?
No, and I think one of the key things that Boris Johnson had talked about before was almost trying to amend the ministerial code, almost to try and suit him. The very fact that he has the ability to do that, I think, is very worrying. The fact that his ethics commissioners have actually resigned on a couple of occasions and the Tories are still looking about whether to replace him or not, again, is another worrying sign. And this isn't just, as I said, this isn't just Boris Johnson. This is the Tory party, the Tory government, having the absolute arrogance to think they can override the democratic right in the Parliament and to do whatever they want. And it's worrying. And as I said, I don't see a change in terms of when a new Prime Minister comes in. Whether that'll change or not, I think we have the same arrogance, the same display of, we know better, if you like, in terms of that. And that for me is worrying. If they start to remove some of the, I suppose, precedents that have been in the Parliament for a long period of time and change the ministerial code just to suit their own circumstances, that's worrying.
It absolutely is, Paul. Thank you. But I think that's enough talking about the Tory psychodrama at the moment. Let's move on to another argument, probably more important story, because more than 200,000 COVID deaths have been recorded across the UK, according to figures from the Office for National Statistics. A total of 200,247 COVID deaths have occurred, with 294 in the last week. The figures include deaths due to COVID-19, as well as those involving the virus. In Scotland, as of the 3rd of July this year, there have been a total of 15,015 deaths registered in Scotland, where the coronavirus COVID-19 was mentioned on the death certificate. Those figures are due to be updated again tomorrow. And in week 26 of this year, there were 61 deaths involving COVID 19. That's 9 more than in the previous week. More than 100,000 deaths had been registered in the UK by early January 2021, less than a year into the pandemic. It has taken more than a year and a half for the death toll to double, with vaccination uptake, better understanding of how to treat the virus, and social distancing measures all contributing to fewer deaths. However, the milestone is a reminder of the current continued impact of COVID 19, with almost a quarter of the fatalities occurring in the past year. Professor Christina Padgell, the director of University College London's Clinical Operational Research Unit, said, "At the moment, there is a narrative of the 'we got the big calls right' on COVID. I just don't think you can look at those numbers and say that. More than 150,000 deaths were in the first two waves, and many countries around the world are nowhere near that figure because they took different actions early in the pandemic. Also, 50,000 of those deaths have happened since last summer. There was a time when the suggestion of 50,000 deaths a year seemed outrageous. Yet we seem to have just accepted that this is the way that it is, when it's much higher than the death toll from an annual flu season. The UK has the highest death tolls in Europe in absolute terms, according to Our World in Data, and a death rate of 2,689 per million people. That rate is lower than Hungary, Italy, or Poland, but higher than in Spain with a rate of 2,295 deaths per million, France with 2,230, and Germany with 1,704 deaths per million people, according to figures from Our World in Data as of the 12th of July. The UK's excess mortality rate is also higher than other European averages, running at 2,098 per million people. That's almost twice that of Germany's, according to Our World in Data. So, Paul, the professor from University College London, said at the moment there's a narrative of "we got the big calls right in COVID," and she said that you can look at these numbers and you just can't say that. So, do you think is that simply more Tory deflection, spin, and deception with regard to these COVID numbers?
Yeah, very much so. And I think there's a theme that kind of runs through this. And I think when you look at the countries that have probably suffered the most in terms of COVID the last number of years, there's a theme, and it seems to be right wing populism. The States through Donald Trump, Brazil, Bolsonaro, and Trump, and obviously the UK through Johnson. In terms of that, in terms of the number of deaths and cases, the figures, in terms of saying they've got the big calls right, doesn't add up at all. Whatever way you want to look at it, if you talk to the medical experts, it doesn't add up. The UK hasn't performed well in these regards. And so I don't think they've got the big calls right. Now, you'll hear Boris Johnson, I heard him talk about it today, is about trying to open up the economy as quick as it possibly could. And you can argue one way or another whether that's right. In terms of the health implications, didn't get it right. And the very fact that we talk about 200,000 deaths as just a number, it's incredibly sobering. That these are 200,000 families that have lost a loved one. So you're talking about millions of people have been impacted. We're again in the situation. We're in the summertime. I suppose there's a wave going on at the moment. In terms of that, there will be more variants, and I think Jason Leach, when he was asked about this a few weeks ago, literally said we're only probably halfway through this, and there will be more variants that will come on that. So we have to be very careful in how we deal with this as we come up to the winter period time again, and how we look at that in terms of vaccinations and so on. And do we need more restrictions? Who knows? In terms of that, we need to see how that goes and listen to what the health individuals are saying, the health experts are saying. But it's a sobering figure: 200,000 people. But the UK certainly didn't get the big decisions right in terms of that.
Well, it is an astonishingly large number, Paul. 200,000 is about twice the population of East Lothian.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
so during the pandemic, it's the equivalent of everyone in East Lothian dying twice. So what
yeah.
do you think is the prospect or the possibility of the reality of these numbers really sinking in with voters?
I think that it's almost. I think because there's no daily figures kind of reported, actively reported as there was before. I think it kind of goes to the back of people's minds. At the moment there are other issues such as the Ukraine war, the cost of living crisis. which again, has to compete with its COVID out there. I think the one key thing that still comes through, our hospitals are still under severe pressure in terms of the number of people they've got in beds that are there, and that impacts on the NHS recovery. So I think that's the one key thing that people have to recognise, that if we don't get the numbers under control, if we don't control this, then obviously the winter time becomes extremely difficult for the NHS in terms of how they can then deal with that. So we need to be prepared for the winter time. If there's a surge or another couple of variants, then there is going to provide real issues for our hospitals, as it is right at this time at the moment. And obviously that impacts on how quickly we can recover in terms of that. So it needs to be still front and centre. We need still to be talking about it. We need to make sure that as we prepare for the winter time, if there are restrictions, we need to be looking at that. If there is, in terms of a vaccination programme, and I know that's been looked at the moment, then that still needs to be front and centre. And we need to make sure that people who haven't been vaccinated get vaccinated. There are still a large number of people who still haven't been vaccinated.
Completely, Paul. Thank you. Now, I'd like to look at the COVID numbers, or COVID more generally, from a slightly different perspective as well, because the UK government is trying to block disclosures to the inquiry that is investigating its handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, according to people with knowledge of the discussions. Officials have asked the government's top lawyer, Sir James Eadie QC, to assess how much information the administration has to provide to the inquiry about its policy discussions during the pandemic. Eadie, who is responsible for advising the government on issues of the highest national importance, has advised the Cabinet to limit the scope of information provided to the inquiry and warned ministers they are likely to face vast claims for damages from the families of COVID victims. The issue raises questions for Conservative leadership candidates, including former Chancellor Rishi Sunak, who designed the controversial Eat Out to Help Out scheme and argued against stronger COVID measures. A spokeswoman for Sunak declined to comment on whether he would follow Eadie's legal advice or permit full disclosures to the inquiry should he become Prime Minister. A spokeswoman for Eadie declined to comment on his behalf. The Cabinet Office said it was that the government was not blocking disclosures because of concerns about payouts to victims. It did, however, decline to comment on the specifics or the existence of any legal advice. Johnson's administration has faced intense criticism over its handling of the pandemic, from the initial decision not to impose restrictions in March 2020 to the £37 billion test and trace system, which proved ineffective, and the delay of the second lockdown in winter 2020. Families have argued that those decisions cost thousands of lives. Responding to reports that the UK is trying to block disclosures to the COVID public inquiry, Laila Moran, the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Coronavirus, said, on the same day that the number of COVID-19 deaths has passed the tragic milestone of 200,000, caretaker ministers are attempting to block vital evidence which could expose their serious failings. While dodging accountability is true to form for this government, those hoping to replace the current Prime Minister must pledge that all evidence will be provided to the inquiry so that lessons can be learned. Those who lost loved ones get the justice they deserve, and voters know the truth when deciding their next Prime Minister. So, Paul, if a Tory government is trying to block evidence for the inquiry, what chance is there that lessons will be able to be learned from the results of that inquiry?
Again, I think it just comes back to the point we've been talking about all this through, is there complete disregard again for the democratic right for them to be held to be held accountable. And I think you just have to compare and contrast the attitude of the Scottish Government, who first of all brought the terms of reference much earlier in terms of our own COVID inquiry in Scotland. It spoke to groups around about what they would like to see in that inquiry. We're very open around about that. I think that you've seen the groups who were impacted, whether that's care home relatives, for example, or in other groups, they've been very open about that and been discussing about the terms, and as I said, of that. So there is as a compare and contrast. Nobody, we were looking back a number of years ago and obviously thinking, would a pandemic happen? I think there was always that case that it was not a case of if, it was a case of when. So it's incredibly important that we learn the lessons if another pandemic hits. we know what we need to do the next time round. So we can't block any evidence. It's damaging. Every government got things wrong. Every government could have done things better. It's incredibly important that we learn the lessons for that and prepare for another pandemic. And again, not when it happens, if it happens, but when it happens again, we've got to be better prepared. So again, it's a complete disregard for parliamentary scrutiny. And for our families that have watched Boris Johnson through Partygate, now trying to block his government, trying to block an inquiry is incredibly insulting to the 200,000 lives that have been lost.
Thanks, Paul. Absolutely right. We'll move on now, however, because the UK's failure to get serious about inequality and weak growth over the past 15 years has left the average British household £8,800 poorer than its equivalent in 5 comparable countries, research has found. A toxic combination of poor productivity and a failure to narrow the divide between rich and poor has resulted in a widening prosperity gap with France, Germany, Australia, Canada, and the Netherlands, a report from the Resolution Foundation has said. The report says that the UK had closed the productivity gap with France and Germany in the 1990s and the first half of the 2000s, but since then, the gap has widened from 6% to 16%, the equivalent of £3,700 per person. While the top 10% of households in Britain were richer than those in many other European countries, middle-income British households were 9% poorer than their counterparts in France, while the poorest fifth of households in Britain were more than 20% poorer than their French and German equivalents. The Resolution Foundation's chief executive, Torsten Bell, said, "Britain is a rich country with huge economic and cultural strengths, but these strengths are not being built on with a recent record of low growth, leaving Britain trailing behind its peers." This forms a toxic combination with the UK's high inequality, leaving low and middle income households far poorer than their counterparts in similar countries. We must turn this around, but we are not on track to do so. We underestimate the scale of our relative decline and are far from serious about the nature of our economy or the scale of change required to make a difference. This has to change. The Foundation's report, Stagnation Nation, coincided with calls from the Confederation of British Industry and the Treasury Select Committee for the government to produce a coherent growth strategy. Now, Paul, if the UK matched the average income and inequality levels of these countries, typical incomes in Britain would be a third higher, and those of the poorest households 2/5 higher. That's astonishing, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And these are policy decisions over a number of years by the UK government that have impacted on this. For years, they've been promoting the gig economy. For years, they've been promoting almost zero hours contracts and so on. And they've had opportunities to change that and have chosen not to do that. There could have been investment in, for example, into manufacturing capability, and more money spent on research and development to try and bring companies from overseas and invest in the UK. Scotland has done well in terms of what it does, in terms of foreign direct investment. We lead the UK and, in fact, lead Europe on that. So these have been policy decisions over a number of years by the UK government. It was laughable a few months ago when you heard Boris Johnson saying that he tried to turn the UK into a high growth, high productivity, highly skilled, I suppose, workforce. They've had policies that have been contradictory to that over a number of years. It's now coming home to roost in terms of that. And we see the growth figures are the lowest in the G7 and sorry, in the G20, apart from Russia. It's the only country that's got lowest growth prospects. It's the highest inflation rate in terms of that. And when it comes down to stagflation, we've got the highest inflation with almost a negative growth moving into recession. Japan, when it was in stagflation, sat there for a long number of years. The UK could be doing that. This is a result of poor policy decision in making by the Conservative Party over a large number of years, and it's coming home to roost now. And we just see the cost of living crisis. That £8,800 that you mentioned, imagine how much difference that would make to people's lives. Imagine how much difference you talked around about to the poorest 40%. It would be an incredible difference. Now we're faced with this cost of living crisis is going to impact on the UK and Scotland more proportionately in a worse way than in the course of Europe. And again, these are policy decisions that have been made by the UK government, which is impacting on Scotland and impacting on the rest of the UK. And more importantly, it's impacting on the most vulnerable in our society. I think we're just at the tip of the iceberg about the cost of living crisis. This winter, I think we'll actually, I mean, we'll actually, and one of the key things we're talking about, been heard about talking about is actually people talking about heat banks, not just food banks, heat banks where people can go and get a heat. This is now the UK in 2022 in terms of heat banks. People have to go elsewhere to get heat. That's what we're facing because of Tory party decisions over the large number of years that have resulted in where we are in just now.
Thanks, Paul. I should apologise. I think we're encountering a wee technical difficulty that means that we can hear you, but we can't see you at the moment. So my apologies for that.
Yeah.
We will persist and we will carry on. But your point about heat banks, absolutely. I'm reminded of the Tom Hanks film Road to Perdition, which is set in the 1920s in Chicago, and buildings filled with people gathering and reading newspapers and gathering to keep warm. It's astonishing that we're back to the 1920s. But let's move to our final item this evening, because a contract worth up to £42 million has been awarded to an Edinburgh-based company, Codebase, to establish 7 new tech scaler hubs across Scotland. The First Minister announced the tech scaler contract, which is one of the largest investments by the Scottish Government into Scotland's potential as an entrepreneurial nation, ahead of an event at the new Berkeley Eagle Lab campus in Glasgow. The investment will support tech founders to scale up their businesses by accessing advice and mentorship from industry experts at the hubs. Partners include Google for Startups UK, Barclays Eagle Labs, and Reforge, a leading San Francisco-based membership program that teaches startups how to grow using Silicon Valley founders' best practice. Our First Minister said, tech startups right across Scotland will have access to world-class education and mentoring and opportunities for peer learning and networking through these tech scalers. For new companies at all stages of development, Scotland will provide one of the most supportive environments in Europe. The CEO and co-founder of Codebase, Stephen Coleman OBE, said, Codebase is delighted to have been awarded the tech scaler contract. We will continue to work closely with our partners, old and new, local and global, to make Scotland one of the most tech startup friendly places in the world. So, Paul, £42 million for technology entrepreneurship. Is that a good investment by the Scottish Government?
Yeah, very much so, and highly supportive of what's been going on. I think you probably just read earlier in the week about Mark Logan being Professor Mark Logan being appointed the chief entrepreneur, and I think he led the review, obviously looking at the future and the possibilities of tech for Scotland. It's forecasted to be one of our fastest growing sectors, and I think the investment in that is a very well spent investment of £42 million. I think there are massive opportunities in terms of developing Scotland in that. We've seen the growth in the fintech sector over the number of years, building on obviously the strong financial services we have, and the fintech sector itself has grown massively. Broadening that out and looking at the tech sector and how we grow the tech sector in Scotland, I think is incredibly important. Having the 7 sites again, I think is incredibly important, and I think it's an opportunity to bring more investment. I talked about the foreign direct investment and the success of the Scottish Government over that in the last number of years. Last year, foreign direct investment in Scotland grew by 14.5%. The average in the UK was 1.8%, and the average in Europe was 5.4%. So we can see how well we're doing in terms of attracting foreign direct investment. If we can get the tech startup, I suppose, industry up and running in Scotland and scale that up, just as we've talked about, there are fantastic opportunities to bring more investment into Scotland and really be a leader worldwide, but certainly in Europe. And it's highly skilled jobs, bringing in a lot of money into our economy. So very supportive of what the Scottish Government are doing in this respect.
Thanks, Paul. And briefly, if I'm correct, I remember that you worked in financial services yourself previously,
Right.
and
Yes.
and you mentioned fintech, and I was wondering just how significant it is that Barclays, who have recently established a new banking campus in Glasgow, how significant it is that a financial services company is right at the heart of this investment and this development.
Yeah, I think that's highly significant. I think Barclays have understood that. I mean, it's probably been about 10 years since I was involved in the financial sector, but I was there for 20 years. In that period of time, technology changed massively. What it could do to try and support the organisations themselves, but not just organisations, the customers. was incredibly important in terms of decision making and how effective they can in that regard. So it's highly significant that Barclays are involved in this. I think they see the possibilities of this, and I know that the other financial organisations are again very keen on this. So yeah, it's highly significant that Barclays are involved in that, and it's great to see. And I think they've had a long term commitment over a period of time to Scotland. So it's great to see them supporting this investment, and it is a vitally important part of our national strategy for economic transformation as well. This is an incredibly important part of it in trying to make Scotland not just competitive about where it is just now within a devolved administration, but when we do achieve our independence, that we can really then start to combine that, for example, with looking at corporation tax, looking at the ability to look at the tax credits for investment and so on. So this is part of it. We can make changes in terms of and support in terms of devolved administration. This helps us when we move towards independence about how we can attract more business in, and Scotland will become highly attractive to investors.
Thanks, Paul. That's a great note to end on this evening, because that is all that we have time for. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes. If you would like to support us, then please subscribe or donate to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen now. You will find our appeals for assistance on Facebook and Twitter are continuing, because the urgent need for financial support has not gone away. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at BroadcastScot. Please like and retweet us there. And you can also find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to the Broadcasting Scotland channel on that platform. Meantime, we will be here again tomorrow evening with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in and join us again then. And that's the way it is at very nearly Scotland at 8. So thank you to everyone who's been watching this evening, and a very special thanks to our very special guest, Paul McLennan. Thanks, Paul.
Andrew, thank you. Always a pleasure. Thank you.
It's been a considerable pleasure. Thank you, Paul. I'm reminded that today in 1174, William I, or William Garve the Rough, fought bravely, meeting a far larger English force head-on, but was captured at the Battle of Alnwick. To secure his release, he swore an oath of allegiance to the English King Henry II, so I'll say no more about him. Please don't go being captured, and please have a very peaceful evening. Bye-bye.